Cole, and welcome everyone. I'm Leonard Garfield, and I'm the director of the Museum of History and Industry. But tonight I'm not coming to you from Mohi, I'm coming to you from my home office. I usually have a fake backdrop of the museum, but I lost my fake backdrop, so you're seeing the real thing. And like you, I'm comfortably dressed in my sweater for this early fall weather. I hope you stayed dry today, but we have a warm evening in terms of conversation. It's going to heat up, I have a feeling. But before we begin the program this evening, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that whenever we gather at Mohi, whether virtually or on site, we recognize that we are on the contemporary and historic lands of the Duwamish people and the Suquamish and other Coast Salish people. And we recognize the forced displacement of our native community and also honor the endurance of the Duwamish people who still live here. And in fact, I do want to tell you that this evening is the Duwamish Tribes Gala event, and I had a chance to be there this evening, and it was a very wonderful time to recognize the endurance and resilience of our Duwamish neighbors. This is also, as we well know, an unprecedented time of protest, specifically against police violence towards Black people. And Mohi, as so many across the country, have stated unequivocally through our work that Black lives matter. So with that as a prologue, I want to welcome you again to this evening. It's the second, as Nicole mentioned, in a series of what we are calling democracy dialogues. These are conversations between leading experts without our interference, but just two people sharing ideas together about provocative topics. And tonight's focus is on the two-party system. And of course, it could not be more timely or frankly more urgent. Democracy dialogues are part of Mohi's broader Stand Up Seattle, the Democracy Project initiative. It will be highlighted by a new exhibit opening when the museum reopens later this fall. And it will also include an online component on mohi.org, and that will launch in mid-October, so be looking for that. And the Stand Up Seattle initiative also includes a whole range of programs, many of them virtual programs like tonight's Democracy Dialogue, all with the goal of better understanding the democratic tradition in our region and helping to strengthen basic civic literacy. So be on the lookout for a lot more to come. And I specifically want to thank tonight's sponsors for culture, and I want to thank our Democracy Dialogue and Stand Up Seattle project supporter, Maureen Frisch, as well. Well, that brings us to tonight's program. You know, when the drafters of the Constitution assembled, they were leery of political parties back in the 1780s. They were concerned of the power that parties could wield eventually. But almost from the start of our nation's history, political parties, and since 1860, two major political parties have in fact dominated our political system. They've morphed over time, we know that. In many ways, for example, the Republican Party has moved from what many considered a radical upstart movement back in the 1850s to a stalwart right of center party today, while the Democratic Party, which for many, many decades included exceptionally conservative, some would say reactionary elements, has now settled into its role as a center-left party in the United States. But even as these two parties have evolved over time, their hold on our system has been strong, maybe intractable, and very few third or fourth party rivals have really received much traction. Why is that? And what does that mean for our self-government? Well, to help shed light on why we have two parties, will that ever change, and what the future holds, I'm honored to introduce our two very special guests this evening. Lance Bennett is Emeritus Professor of Political Science and Communication at the University of Washington. Professor Bennett is the founding director of the Center for Communication and Civic Engagement and has published widely on the role of communication in democratic life, including problems that we are familiar with now of disinformation and the role of political organizations in undermining trust in our public institutions. And I'd like to begin by welcoming Christopher Sebastian Parker. Dr. Parker is a professor of political science at the University of Washington. He is a graduate of UCLA and of the University of Chicago. Dr. Parker also served in the United States Navy. Chris is currently at work on a new book, The Great White Hope, Donald Trump, Race, and the Crisis of American Democracy. Please welcome Dr. Chris Parker.
Thank you, Leonard, for such a gracious introduction. And thank you, Mohai, for inviting Lance and I, my esteemed senior colleague, senior in age, but not rank. And so Lance and I, we often have discussions around politics. Lance is extremely well read. Lance has been there and done that. So I learned a lot from him. So I was really pleased that he accepted the invitation to join me in this Mohai event that we're having right now. So let me open, first of all, with the idea that, I think we all know that we're at a really dangerous crossroads right now, not only in American politics, but in American history writ large. It seems like every day something different is happening. Because of, I respect everybody, I'm going to keep this as clean as I can. I'm not going to mention Donald Trump as the president. I'll either refer to him as that man or 45 or something like that. So, but largely because of him, but let's get this 100% clear, you guys. He didn't get there by himself. People had to vote for him in order to put him into office. So, and that's where we start talking about the party system, because it's the Republican Party we're talking about. He represents the Republican Party, though he's not always been a Republican. But he was put in office by the Republican electorate, and the Republican Party has been drifting to the right at a rapid pace for the last, 50 years or so, going on 60 years. And one of the things that I would like to mention by way of the comments that Leonard gave in his opening remarks is that, yes, he's right that, the Democrats back in the day were the party of the Klan. He says they're reactionary, and I really agree with him on that. And the Republican Party was a party of racial moderation, but they called it radical republicanism back then. So when we see the current alignment of today's parties, happened roughly around the mid-1960s. That's when Johnson was running for a term on his own right, and he was opposed by Barry Goldwater. And Johnson came out very early and declared the Democrat Party to be the party of racial reform. And Barry Goldwater shortly thereafter came out and declared the Republican Party as a party of racial regress, right? Racial progress, racial regress. And so that's essentially where we are. However, since that time, the Republican Party has run seemingly at a breakneck pace further and further to the right. And that, because of something that's called the median voter theorem, it's dragged the Democrat Party further to the right. And Lance is going to elaborate on that shortly. So I'll leave that to my colleague Lance. But what I will say is I want to try to explain how we got to where we are in the present moment. And then where we're likely to go in the balance of the time I have for my opening remarks. So how we got to the present moment begins, at least proximately, with the election of Barack Obama, the first non-white president of the United States. And a lot of people thought that that was going to be a time during which we moved to a more post-racial era. Nothing, however, can be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, as I talk in my most recent book, it's on the Tea Party. It's called Change They Can't Believe In, the Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in the United States. Well, in that book, my colleague and co-author Matt Barretto and I argued that it was the election of President Barack Obama that really started the most current reactionary movement and moving the Republican Party even further to the right. But it actually really began in the 1960s. That is to say, when the civil rights movement had reached its heyday and had basically plateaued right around 1968 with the ratification of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It had reached its zenith with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then of course a year prior to that, Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now what happened was it led to what some people term as a white backlash, right? And so white people were basically saying, hey, look, you guys got everything you wanted. Why are you guys, quote unquote, rioting in 1967 and 1968? Well, the fact of the matter is that the North, if you will, or beyond the South, there was no need for a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act per se, because we didn't have segregation, right? And we didn't have all of these repressive measures that were beyond the South, at least when it comes to the law, right? So there was de facto segregation, for example, and de jure segregation, for example, de facto by custom, de jure by law. So it was de facto outside of the South, de jure in the South. And that's what the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act took care of, especially the Civil Rights Act. But things were still happening outside of the South. And so what happened was you started having, these people who had been, prior to that point, Democrats, they started voting Republican first and then started identifying with the Republican Party thereafter. And it just took off to the right. So that's how we got to where we are now. Essentially, it started in the mid to late 1960s, and it just continued apace all the way through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the election of Obama. Boom, here we are now. And where are we likely to go? Well, let me just tell you guys right now, even if Vice President or former Vice President Biden wins, the country is going to be in a shambles for quite some time. It's not like these feelings are going to go away. So Trump may leave center stage, but the people that put him in office in the first place will remain. And the people that are progressives, right, that really didn't see these people before who voted for Trump, right, they see them now. And so the country is going to remain, cauldron of conflict for quite some time. And like where we're going to go eventually, 20, 30 years from now, I think the country will be a much better place because we had to see this, because for the most part, for the longest period of time, people would question whether or not racism still existed, especially after Barack Obama was elected, right? Racism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia, right? Women were gaslighted, people of color were gaslighted, immigrants were gaslit. Like, are these things still really a problem? Well, now you have the chief offender literally at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So these things can no longer be denied. And the sad part is people are acting out on them now because it's like the president of the United States is saying all this stuff, so it must be okay. He legitimizes this stuff. So that's where we are now. Where we're likely to go, it's going to be a cauldron of conflict, like I said a few minutes ago. But then after that, I think things will get much better. But what we're concerned with rather right now is what's happening right now, the here and now, and in the near future. And with that, I will turn it over to my esteemed senior colleague, Lance Bennett.
Thank you, Chris. Good opener. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here, wherever you may be. I think Chris painted the big picture really well. What I'd like to do is two things. In 2 or 3 minutes, zoom in on really what I see as critical institutional crises that we're facing, and then zoom out and talk about the role of the parties, primarily the Republicans, but the Democrats are not blameless in this, in bringing these crises about. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Chris to drill into the American voter a little bit and why they respond to the kinds of messages that the parties are sending out, especially the Republicans these days. So let's look for a minute about where we are right now. It's shocking for me to say these things, but I feel that just a recap of a few of the highlights, or I should say lowlights, of our present moment. We've just learned that there was an armed militia group plotting to kidnap and put on trial for treason the governor of the state of Michigan. I should point out that earlier, when armed militias occupied the state capital of Michigan, organizational help was provided by one of the DeVos family foundations of Betsy DeVos family. And so these kinds of initiatives are being encouraged and assisted by some of the people in office today. At the same time, Donald Trump has asked the right-wing militias in the debate last week to stand down but stand by. And at the same time, he encouraged people to go to the polls to make sure that they were going to be properly conducted. If you step back a little bit from that statement by Trump, and this is where I want to try and encourage us not to put all of this on Trump. Trump is simply sort of a late-breaking symptom of an underlying set of more serious problems. For example, as we speak, the National Republican Party is in the process of mobilizing 50,000 poll watchers to go out all across the country. The Republican Party of the state of Pennsylvania plans to have 1,600 poll watchers in Philadelphia alone. And we all know how critical Pennsylvania is. And why is this happening? Why is this possible? Only because a court order ran out in 2015 banning such activities because of the long history of the Republican Party to use poll watchers to intimidate voters, particularly in Black voting districts, sending off-duty police officers to the polls to discourage people or scare them away from voting. So that court order to stop that expired in 2018, and so now it is likely to happen again with the encouragement not just of Trump, but of the entire Republican Party. At the same time, the Trump family and associates such as Roger Stone, who was conveniently pardoned by Trump not long ago, are claiming that the election is already compromised, that mail balloting should be blocked. And Trump tried to cleverly, but not too clever, it turned out, take over the post office to disrupt mail voting. But nonetheless, questions have been raised about the integrity of the mail ballot system. There, of course, is no basis for these questions. As we know, there's no basis for so many of the things that we're hearing these days. And Trump surrogates, like the aforementioned Roger Stone, have gone on national programs like Rush Limbaugh's very popular radio show and urged federal marshals to seize the Nevada ballots because the election is allegedly corrupted. And he urged Trump to federalize state police forces. Very interesting kinds of developments there. So that's just a thumbnail sketch of some of the low points of our current moment. So here's the questions. How can this be happening? How did we get here? And what does it have to do with political parties? And my answer is, it has a lot to do with political parties. But I want to start this analysis by just kind of emphasizing once again, Trump did not cause all of this. He has contributed to it. I prefer to think of Trump as a malignant symptom of institutional rot that has been contributed to by both parties, but primarily the Republicans, and I'll tell you why. So let's start with the Republicans. I'll pick up a few minutes on the Democrats as well. But here's the problem for the Republicans. They are basically, and have been historically, at least through the last century, a party that represents business interests and wants to run a government that favors business interests. But the problem is, how do you sell that to a majority of citizens in a democracy who are not going to be happy with low-paying jobs, with little social welfare, with expensive education, with no retirement programs, all because the government favors business and corporate interests. So the Republicans have kind of been on this tight wire for a long time, especially since World War II, when the Great Depression and the war resulted in an interesting set of compromises that tried to balance the interests of labor and business. And how did the Republicans navigate that legacy of the Depression? They navigated it poorly, but importantly by running kind of moderate candidates for president, Dwight Eisenhower being the notable example. And because the Democrats still controlled Congress in this post-war area, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, Republicans, whether it's Dwight Eisenhower or later Richard Nixon, ended up actually having to support fairly liberal policies, social policies and environmental policies. The Environmental Protection Agency, which is currently being trashed, was set up under the Nixon administration. So several things happened, however, historically in the middle of all this sort of juggling of the Republicans, trying to balance a business interest with public opinion. Two things happened that I think changed everything, changed the game for both of the parties. The first was the Democrats passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which realigned parties in the South toward the Republicans, and the solid South had been Democrat and racist. But the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act changed that game. And we're still living with the legacy of that. And the second thing, and that of course moved race to the top of the Republican agenda. And the second thing that happened was that Keynesianism as an economic policy that understood government as the great economic engine for society ran aground at the end of the 60s. In the US as a result of the Great Society programs, which were very expensive, and the Vietnam War, which was also very expensive. The US had a debt crisis that it couldn't pay off, so all bets were off in the post-war economic order. And this was the opportunity that many that were even on the farthest right fringe of the Republican Party economically seized, producing a new economic outlook called these days neoliberalism, which was a policy of shrinking government, privatizing public services, putting things on a pay-as-you-go basis. Look at tuitions in state universities across this country today, and essentially wiping out social welfare programs on the grounds that they made people dependent on government. This agenda was sold effectively by the greatest national pitchman of the last 100 years, Ronald Reagan. And Reagan sold this as a morning in America where individual freedom would prosper again when people were relieved of the yoke of big, burdensome government. But it turns out that the policies that came along under that rosy fairy tale about morning in America were regressive. There were regressive taxes. There were losses of unions. Reagan began the process of busting labor unions in this country, very effectively so, shrinking the social safety net. And suddenly, by the end of the Reagan era, people were beginning to get the wake-up call that freedom also meant risk, insecurity, wage stagnation, poor jobs, bad schools, and expensive public services like colleges and state universities. So all of a sudden, the selling of this Republican agenda was even more difficult than before. Enter the sort of Republican brain trust from Lee Atwater to Karl Rove, who decided that what we would do is put together the grand symbolic coalition that would not threaten our economic program. We would let them eat symbols while we continue policies that favor the rich and the corporate interests. So they put together the coalition that we still live with today, by the way, of guns, God, anti-abortionism, and racism. But even that is not enough, and I'm going to come back to that point enough. That is Trump's hardcore 40%. And he's actually expanded that into the white supremacist neo-Nazi fringe that the earlier Republican Party was afraid to at least openly address. But the Democrats were beginning to get worried because this coalition appeared to be workable. And indeed, it elected George Bush I. And so Bill Clinton was blessed by a third-party candidacy and got in, but didn't have the stable support base that he needed. And so Bill Clinton began moving to the right and took the Democratic Party with him to the right. And he was joined in a similar kind of developments in other countries, Tony Blair in the UK, Schroeder in Germany, and the parties of the center left, like the Democrats, the Labor Party, the Social Democrats, all began to tilt more in the direction of favoring corporate interests over labor. And so Clinton signed NAFTA. He actually took welfare reform away from the Republicans, and he relaxed banking regulations. And by the time we reached the beginning of this century, both parties had undermined public support. So you began seeing polls in which neither party was trusted, government was not trusted. People began to distrust many public institutions. So the result of all this was an erosion of public institutions and the credibility of public institutions, which, by the way, produce most of the authoritative information that we see in the news. When institutional trust is eroded, authoritative information becomes suspect, and people begin looking for alternative facts. That's a part of the story we can talk about a little bit more in Q&A. So when trust in government began to crash, how do you get elected? Both parties faced this same dilemma. Well, you start opening the doors to money in politics. And so the cost of getting elected in this country at almost every level, from local to national, has soared because people aren't buying it. And so you have to sell it harder and harder and harder. And so as a result of the washing of money through our electoral system, we have a politics that's based on deception, disinformation, hate, and propaganda. Again, more on the Republican side than the Democrat side, but I want to, get back to that in just a second. What we find today is that polls, in addition to showing that people don't trust government, don't trust the parties, don't trust many of our public institutions, also have come to recognize the problem of money in politics and calling it corruption. So majorities of the public understand corruption to be a critical top problem in American politics today. The result of all of this sort of selling of extreme symbolic politics has been to amplify social divisions in this country, as Chris was saying just a minute ago. And so we are left today with neither party having a particularly sellable program. The Republicans, however, are determined to maintain power at any cost. So how did they do that? In addition to all the disinformation that has been coming disproportionately from that side of the aisle, beginning in the 90s and ramping up into high levels in the 2000s, the Republicans have mounted efforts at the state and local levels to essentially undermine representation in democratic processes. So we have gerrymandering in the swing states. These are targeted projects. So you have gerrymandering in states like Wisconsin and North Carolina and other important states that could go either way, but will go Republican if voters can't vote for Democrats. And so today in Wisconsin, at the legislative level, you need 58% of the votes to elect a Democratic legislature. That's just one example. I could tell you similar stories about Texas, about Florida, and other cases. We have voter identification and registration barriers that have limited voter participation in many cases. And as I say, we have had and are now seeing again intimidation at the polls by poll watchers working for the party, the Republican Party in particular. So, and then to finish off this project, how do you legalize that? Because that's kind of illegal. I mean, it's against the law, it's unconstitutional. So how do you legalize it? Simple, you pack the courts. And so you have Mitch McConnell's judiciary project that is filling the federal judiciary with supportive Republican judges who will support all of these otherwise illegal and unconstitutional activities. So here we are today, and one after another, the institutional firewalls of democracy that actually protect the core of it, namely representation, equal representation under the law, are being torn down. We are a nation divided and terribly polarized. And Republican Party strategies have ramped up both the institutional tear down and the symbolic screaming, the symbolic, catering to hate, racism, gender, religion, all of the things that an inclusive society should not be addressing in these ways. So in particular, I see the Republicans today as institutionally attacking the firewalls, but also at the same time playing up divisive symbols such as race and imagined threats to white American citizens. So that brings us to Chris's analysis of race and status threat.
Thanks, Lance. Wow, that was quite a tour de force. So what I'll do is I'll quickly outline my points, and what I'll do is I'll talk about voter preferences for people on the right, I should say Republicans who are in the mass public, the everyday Republican voter, and then I'll go back in history and apply this framework to different historical eras. So the first thing I'll say is that, so this thing called status threat, it's about this idea that that we're losing our country. Those people over there are stealing our country. And what we see is, we see this not only happening here, but we see this reactionary impulse at other places as well. We see it in most places in Western Europe. We even see it in Central Europe, and Orban's Hungary, right? We also see it, with the Law and Justice Party in Poland, right? We see it even in Norway, right? We see it in the Netherlands. We see it in Germany with IFD. We see it in France, with I think it's the New Rally Party, it used to be called the National Front or Front National. We see it everywhere, right? We see it in Brazil with Bolsonaro. This sort of impulse is everywhere. And this is idea that, oh, we're losing our country to those people. But let's go back to the American context. In the American context, real Americans feel like they're losing their country to people like me and immigrants from brown countries, right? But there's also a cultural change aspect to this too. Like you start having, more women, who are in positions of power and influence, right? You see it happening you see this antipathy towards migrants. You see this antipathy towards people who have alternative lifestyles, right? And let me tell you what all these things have in common. They're not real, quote unquote, Americans. And let me define real American for everybody, right? It's white, male, typically middle class or older, straight, native born. If you can't check all those boxes, you are screwed, right? And so if we go back and think about this in historical context, so let's think about the Know Nothing Party and I don't want to get into great detail, but the Know Nothing Party of the 1850s, right? So the Know Nothing Party, they were really anti-immigrant. And so we go from a Know Nothing, and parts of the Know Nothing Party, to my chagrin at least, part of them went with the Democrats. That's the southern wing of the Know Nothing Party. The northern wing of the Know Nothing Party went with the eventual Republicans. So now let's swing to Reconstruction. So radical Reconstruction. So you started having, and they called it radical republicanism. Why was it radical? Well, because they wanted to give black people rights. They called that shit radical. Sorry, but I kind of go here when I start talking about this kind of stuff. It was radical for that reason. And so then you had this period that was called redemption that set in. And what I'm trying to illustrate to you guys is wherever we see racial progress, racial regress is not far behind. It is a dynamic that is as old as American history. The first time we saw it was in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? We see it again after World War I. You started having these black soldiers come back. You start having these black soldiers returning from war. You see the Harlem Renaissance, and guess what happens right after that? The race riots, the bloody summer of 1919, right? I don't know how many of you guys have seen the HBO series Watchmen and the Tulsa race riots that happened in 1921. Well, you know what got torn up in the Tulsa race riots of 1921? The black neighborhood called Greenwood. And Greenwood was better known back in the day as Black Wall Street. right? Tore that down because black people got too uppity, right? This is Oklahoma, early 1920s. We see it happen again, after World War II. We see it happen again after World War II. You start having black soldiers return. You start seeing the burgeoning civil rights movement. We see Smith v. Allwright that tore down, or what was called the white primary, that really permitted the Democrat Party to have a lock on Southern politics. So Smith v. Allwright was passed in 1944. And then you had Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, right? And then you had this thing called massive resistance, right? That really resisted the integration of public schools in the South, all right? Civil rights movement continues. And then what do we see? Right in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, right? And then you have the quote unquote race riots. Then you start seeing the Republican Party move further and faster to the right. Then the next time this happened was the election of Barack Obama, right? And then boom, what happened after that? We get Trump. So there's always this dynamic playing out, in American history. And it is driven by this idea that we are losing, that is to say, real Americans, we are losing our country to them, right? And it's not the entire Republican Party. Let me get this straight right now. There's an establishment wing of the Republican Party, and there is a reactionary wing of the Republican Party. And the reactionary wing of the Republican Party is driven by status threat. Now, how can we identify status threat? It's this sense of what's called ethnocentrism, the sort of belief in one's in-group, that one's in-group is superior, one in-group is culturally superior, the in-group's religion is superior, and their way of life, just generally speaking, is superior, right? So that's one piece of it. The other piece is what is known as paranoid social cognition. That is to say, it's not sort of clinical paranoia in a sense, but it's this idea that anxiety that begins to emerge when things are in flux, right? So when they see Obama get elected, it's like, oh shit, wait a second. This is not the country I thought it was. This is not the America that I've come to know and love. Things are happening too fast, right? And it leads to this paranoia. And then the other component to status threat is what's called existential threat. This idea that our culture, our way of life is in danger and under threat. And what happens is that it leads these people to do whatever it takes to retain their social prestige, their group's social prestige. And that is a problem, right? And that is different from establishment conservatives and establishment Republicans. So here's the difference between an establishment Republican and a reactionary Republican. An establishment Republican will see political differences as something that can be negotiated, right? It's something that can be negotiated. They're very, very pragmatic in that sense. But a reactionary, on the other hand, sees them, so they see the opposition, or they see their political opponent rather, as evil, and them is on the side of good. So they have this Manichaean way of looking at the world, and there's no brooking any difference between good and evil, right? And so that's why they're willing to go, to the limits in order to protect their social prestige. That's why we never see any real negotiations right now between Democrats and Republicans, because for Republicans, these reactionary types who are actually running the Republican Party, for them to brook a deal with Democrats is to capitulate to evil, and they just won't do it. We had the comprehensive immigration reform, Senate Bill 744, I think it was 2013. For all intent and purposes, that was a very conservative bill, but it couldn't get past the House, right? You know why it couldn't get past the House? Because the Republican Party is 90% white, right? And we start talking about what's happening in these congressional districts, right? If any one of those Congress people, right, had deigned to support that bill, because these districts are so homogenous, they would have gotten kicked out. They would have been turned out of office. These are the things that happens with status threat. Status threat that therefore promotes this polarization that we're seeing right now. And there is no negotiating whatsoever with these reactionary types in the Republican Party. There will be no negotiation with them, right? How did Trump get into office? They put him in the office because he was saying everything they wanted him to say. They didn't like Romney because Romney was too nice. He was too, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? He was too establishment. So Trump gets in office and they will back this guy. This 40% of the population will back this man come hell or high water. That's why he could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, at least until recently, right? And nothing would happen to him because the Republican wing of the party, the reactionary wing of the Republican Party is running that party. And they're running that party based off of their subscription to negative affect, fear, anger, and anxiety. Furthermore, if we think about the cognitive psychology literature, we know that people are more sensitive to losses than gains. And so therefore, if they feel like they're losing their country, they're going to be more likely to do something about it. So now I think we're running a little bit, we're running a little short on time. I'm going to turn it back over to Lance at this point.
Thanks, Chris. So where are we today after all of this? Well, as I see it, we today have a political system that has been shaped by these parties, as I said, more the Republican, but with some assist from the Democrats, that successfully blocks legislation favored by super majorities of citizens, blocks gun control, blocks abortion rights, blocks fair tax policies, and blocks campaign finance and lobbying reform, which are, of course, favored by majorities of Americans. But equally importantly, and this is where the election comes into play prominently, it's a system that limits political representation for the bottom 30 to 40% of the income ladder, which disproportionately includes Blacks and other minorities. And the third feature of the political system that we have today is that we're on the brink of institutional collapse. All of those firewalls that I've been talking about are beginning to be torn down. So are we poised for an authoritarian takeover? That's how it happens. How do democracies die? We're looking at it. So where are we going to go from here? Well, soon we're going to see if there's enough institutional strength, if the courts, for example, can support some kind of serious interpretations of the law to restore voting rights and so on. We will see if there's enough institutional strength to withstand a stolen election, because I think that's what we're looking at. Not just by Trump, although Trump is the enabler in chief, but supported by the majority of the Republican Party, as Chris mentioned, led by these reactionary Republicans. So here's the question about what happens if somehow we prevail. Let's say democracy. Let's say if democracy prevails, what happens? So let's say the Democrats win the presidency and perhaps even take the Senate. Here's my question. Will they have the bandwidth and the will to A, reform campaign finance and lobbying? That has to happen. To change tax policies to rein in inequality, to address systemic racism, and to really make the economic adjustments that our environmental crisis requires. Those are hard tasks. Those are very challenging tasks, particularly considering that we're facing an unprecedented, at least in the modern era, public health crisis and an economic meltdown. So the risk is that the Democrats will spend all their political capital on trying to just get us through those immediate crises without necessarily addressing the bigger problems with democracy that I just mentioned. So I'm going to leave it to Chris to tell us how all that's going to go.
Well, so first of all, once again, very lucid points, Lance. In the short term, I really think that the country is going to be, even if Biden wins, or as Lance so ably put it, even if democracy wins, I'm not confident that the country is going to emerge from this period in the short term absent conflict. I think conflict will remain intact in this country for quite some time. And I think even if Biden wins, I mean, we're still going to be rife with conflict throughout his presidency. So I think his presidency will be saddled with this. After that, however, I mean, I think the country has really reached an inflection point right now. Well, I think we're almost there. We're like 99% there. And then, you know, I think we'll actually hit it sometime between the election day and the inauguration. We'll hit an inflection point, and then hopefully, you know, the country start coming back up, but it's going to take real time. One thing I want to add to this is that people, you know, pine for the days before Trump got elected and the status quo. Well, you know, for people like me, the status quo wasn't so good, right? Okay, don't let the bookshelf behind you and diplomas on the wall fool you, right? I'm still a Black man in America, and I get treated as such almost every day. I am reminded of my race every day. And it's not pleasant. And there are lots of other people that are like me. There are women out there, right, who have to face sexism, right? There are women of color who have to face sexism and racism. And frankly, going back to the status quo for people like us is not a fucking option. Not going to happen, right? So we have to figure out a better way in order to make America make good on its promises to us. And I mean all of us. And that means, frankly, on the part of white men, that's going to call for a whole lot of sacrifice from you guys, because you guys are the ones in the position of power. You guys are the hegemonic social group in the United States. So that means you guys have to be all in on this, because if you're not, this is not going to work. So that's what I'll say. I'll leave you guys with that. Look, you know, I know it's not, all unicorns and butterflies and ponytails and all that stuff and rainbows. Life is complicated. The United States is complicated right now. When anybody asks me, how you doing today, Chris, you know what I tell them? First thing out of my mouth, I'm a Black man in America. Boom, conversation stopper right there. But which is not to say that I'm completely bereft of hope. In the short term, it's going to be a tough go. It's going to be a really rough ride. In the long term, I think we'll be in a much better place. I'll turn it over to Lance to close us out.
I think it's time for questions. Thank you, Chris. Well put.
And boy, I think when I introduced you guys, I said provocative, but you have certainly given us that. You've also given us an awful lot of honesty and thought. And I think I speak for all of our participants in that we thank both of you guys so much, Lance Bennett and Christopher Parker. And Chris, we're going to be looking for that book. When is that book coming out? That's my question.
You know, that's my question too.
Okay, I won't put you on the spot, but we'll look for it when it does.
Hopefully sometime late next year.
Okay, all right, good enough. You know, Christopher said something, Lance as well, that we're having this conversation prior to the election. But this election is an ongoing process. Democracy is an ongoing enterprise that we are all a part of. So our hope is that we'll keep this conversation going, and hopefully with you guys we can keep it going. But we have quite a group online with us tonight, and not a single person dropped off this call, that's pretty good. And so let's get to their questions right away. And there are 3. And if you have questions, by the way, as you're listening, either put them in the chat box and they'll be forwarded to me, or you can put them in that box that says, I think you can do this directly, it says question and answer. But you guys, had a big picture, but we're going to start with the first question, which is drilling down a little bit in terms of specifically the 2-party system and its kind of lock. What about if there was ranked choice voting, where voters don't just vote for one person, but they get to pick a second and a third? I think this has been an experiment that I understand from our audience has been tried in Maine, maybe elsewhere in the US. What do you guys think? Let's see, who should I throw that to? I mean, Christopher's nodding. You're a political scientist. What do you think about ranked choice voting?
Well, he's a political scientist too, and he's been
Oh,
around
you are,
longer
Lance?
than
Okay.
me. Okay, so I think ranked choice voting is designed, at least as far as I know, according to what little piece of the literature I've read, is supposed to moderate views. So you pick like you were talking about, Leonard. So you have your first choice, then you have a second choice, and then perhaps there's even a tertiary choice. And so, generally speaking, by the time we get to our second and third choices, those are going to be more and more, generally speaking, more moderate selections, right? So it's ranked choice voting, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, rather, is about building consensus, right? It's like the second or third choice, right? We all know, look, I like Beyonce, right? But she's married to Jay-Z, right? So I might have to roll that down to somebody that's a little more in my wheelhouse, or than someone that's in my league, right? And so I think more realistic, right? And so I think the same principle applies, right? One might want someone, let's just say for sake of argument, like Bernie Sanders, right? But they wind up at somebody like Joe Biden. That's exactly where we are, right? Someone that's more of a consensus, at least for the Democrat Party.
Yeah.
Lance?
Yeah, Lance, let me ask you also, when you answer, Lance, I want you to spin it also from not just ranked choice voting, but what we have here in our state, which is the blanket primary. And I'm noticing on my ballot that I'm voting between two people who are in the same party. So I guess the question from our listeners was, do either of these systems help loosen the grip of a strictly two-party system, or in the case of, or do they reinforce it, maybe make it even
No, they would. I mean, this is a more downstream tweaking of a system that needs much more fundamental change. Voting on other teams sort of makes sense only if you have more than two parties. And I don't think that we're going to get rid of the two-party system, because the parties actually make the rules, and the states are the center of where these rules are played out. So if we had two things that we could do, go to a proportional representation, multi-party system, and get rid of the Electoral College, which could come back to bite us badly in this election, those would start off a process which then could go to the level of things like ranked choice voting very productively.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting comment. And I have to, let me ask you, Chris, because the whole Electoral College is embedded in institutional racism, because essentially it's giving more power to states that had slavery and so forth and so on. And it's so woven through our system now that it has, twice in our own recent history, essentially flipped the popular vote. I remember when I was growing up, in the 60s, it was, well, the electoral, but that's never going to happen. I mean, that happened once, right? or twice. I think John Quincy Adams got elected with a minority of the vote, but it's happened twice in the last, 20 years or so. What do you guys think about the Electoral College?
My sentiment mirrors yours. I mean, there was another time that was really consequential in the 1876 election,
right?
Hayes and Tilden, right? Well, a deal was struck, and that was actually the beginning of Jim Crow and serious redemption back then, because Hayes was seated. Hayes was a Republican, but the Democrats required them to remove the military, right, from these southern states, and they started going backwards, right? So that was another instance in which we had a split vote, the Electoral College versus the popular vote. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. But in order to rid ourselves of that, we have to have a constitutional amendment, right? And that requires, 38 states to ratify it, and then you have to have supermajorities in the House and in the Senate. Ain't happening anytime soon. Yeah. So as much as we might revile it, because it is anti-democratic, small d, right, and anti-democratic, big D, for that matter, right? It's not going anyplace anytime soon because of the institutional requirements to rid ourselves of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's all entangled, and we know that one of the most recent amendments, the Equal Rights Amendment, is still not ratified. So
Exactly.
It is hard, as Christopher is pointing out, it's hard to get that supermajority of not only the U.S. Congress but the states as well. Another question from the audience dealt with something that we hear about every year, it seems like, but certainly every 4 years, and that's campaign finance reform. Lance, do you have any thoughts about whether we're ever going to be able to get a hold of this, or do you think that Supreme Court decision where corporations were essentially treated as individuals is really going to make this nearly impossible?
Yeah, I mean, as long as we have this or even more right-leaning Supreme Court, it's never going to happen, because they know that the only way they can win, the Republicans that is to cheat. And so they're cheating. And in campaign finance reform and the whole collection of post Citizens United decisions, which have actually made it worse. I mean, everybody thinks about Citizens United and treating corporations as people and so on. But in many ways, the even more fundamental problem is the agreement to allow political organizations to qualify as tax-exempt charitable organizations in which they are serving public welfare. So to take an example, Charles Cook convenes a national donors conference every year, and what passes, and he raises billions of dollars for an agenda that includes things like packing the courts and taking over state legislatures and sharing information about how they can gerrymander their states. All of that stuff is part of the agenda that they raise billions of dollars to implement by pouring it into campaigns for legislators who will support that agenda. All of that is charitable and regarded as social welfare function, because 50% of the Koch political organizations are performing the social welfare function of educating billionaires in how to take over democracy. That's the social welfare function of those tax-exempt organizations. So it's not just campaign finance, it's really getting the money out of the Koch network, which includes from time to time the Mercers, the DeVos, the Mellons, the Scaifes, and a number of families. They represent a political organization that has more resources and is better organized than either of the political parties today.
You know, Lance, you have ESP, because you're segueing to the very next question that I've got on the list here from our attendees. And that is, why do some Americans continue to support policies, or, by extension, political parties, stands that do net effect favor business more than, other interests? Why is that?
It's actually simple. They're not supporting those policies. They're supporting racial policies, anti-immigration policies. They're supporting religion. They're supporting a Supreme Court nomination that will overturn Roe v. Wade. That's what they're supporting, the whole menu of symbolic politics, and under which is flying the business agenda of the Republican and the Democratic parties.
He's totally right about that. I mean, I was all ready to tee that one up, but he took the words right out of my mouth.
Oh, go ahead, add something.
Add to it, Chris.
It's not about material self-interest, right? It's really not. I mean, when Trump got elected, people were talking about, the working class whites and economic anxiety. And not only me, but a few other colleagues just completely blew that away, because you had a lot of people who were not economically anxious that still supported Trump, right? You had a whole lot of people that weren't economically anxious who supported the Klan of the 1920s, right? This is not about material self-interest. This is about this sense of existential threat to their way of life. And as Lance said, religion, right? Racism, right? These are threats to their way of life, right? This completely, pun intended, trumps all that other stuff.
Let me change the lens a little bit and look more locally. This is getting to one of our questions. You know, we at MOHI spent a lot of time looking at local and regional history, and there's really a pretty remarkable story of mid-century Seattle and into the subsequent decades of. I mean, there were a lot of problems that weren't addressed, and there certainly was a lot of exclusion of people and interests. But there was also a lot of coming together, sort of common sense approaches. There was a civic sensibility, if you will, that allowed people of a variety of political perspectives at sort of a national level or a policy level, if you will, to really sort of get around the table and try to tackle issues. And so my question for you is, at this point, if this is an inflection point in democracy, writ large in the US, what are some of the things that individuals can do, and maybe at the local level, to deal with this situation?
What?
Wow, what a question. I mean, as I look at Seattle, as I drive through the Westlake corridor, up Denny, and down Boren, and all I see are construction sites of giant steel and glass buildings. And the corporatization and the gentrification of this city, where, in my view, a sort of a meaningful community would be diverse, it would be inclusive, it would involve people sharing common values and agendas. And I'm seeing that Seattle is becoming really much more gentrified. I think people still miss the old Seattle. I mean, not that it was ever a paradise, but that it felt like there was more community. It felt like people were paying more attention to each other. But now, if there are service jobs ever to return to the downtown that is currently boarded up in Seattle, those people can't live here. I mean, those people can't live here anymore. So I guess that the beginning of community is not that we should all pitch together and have neighborhood meetings. I mean, that's not a bad idea. But I think that we should figure out how to make this city affordable and livable for as many people down the economic ladder as we possibly can. And then we'll begin to be able to talk about community, because community needs to include everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let me comment on this. So I think what I heard you saying, Leonard, is sort of taking what's happening, at the national level and sort of seeing what we can do at the local level. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me start off by saying this. And I know this is probably going to make some of you clutch your pearls out there, but look, Seattle is not the most racially progressive place. It's not the racially progressive place you guys think it is. I did a survey in 2016 and published a piece in Crosscut shortly thereafter, in which I showed, when it comes to racism, that King County was only maybe 2 or 3 percentage points better, if you will, than Eastern Washington. So take that for what it's worth. And if it's only 2 or 3 percentage points, then it's within a margin of error, which means there is really no difference, right? So I think one thing we need to do, or I think one thing I think white people need to do is try to get, I mean, I think what we saw, in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, I mean, I think that was really heartening. I mean, if that could be sustained, for any period of time, like if that's just not a one-off, right? If this is actually a movement, not a moment, I think in many ways that'll go a long way towards, healing what's going on in our own communities, right? But it has to be a movement, and it cannot just be confined to that one moment. And I think people need to recognize this, right? They need to recognize how complicit they are, in the racism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia. And once that recognition takes place, which I would imagine is really hard, right? But once that takes place, then learning can begin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. We have a question from the participants who are asking kind of an open-ended question. And I think, Lance, this is right up your alley, because the question is, can you and Chris give your thoughts on the role of the media in this discussion? And I know that's a big question.
That is Lance. I'm going to say this.
Okay, we're going to give that to Lance.
Media guy.
Everybody wants to know what can we do about truth in media?
Well, there's no one media, as there might have been more or less 50 years ago. There, in terms of like broadcast, there are two media systems. One of them that is watched by about 55, some maybe 60% of Americans, that includes CNN and NBC and ABC and CBS and PBS and all of that, from the Wall Street Journal to Mother Jones. And that's kind of the spectrum that might have represented American values 50 years ago. But today it only represents 55, 60% of Americans' information-seeking needs and values. On the other side, there's a propaganda system that includes Fox, Breitbart, Daily Caller, all of those sites out there on the fringe, InfoWars, and then bleeding into the internet world, 4chan and 8chan, and networks such as that. And they're pumping out disinformation. And that disinformation leaks into Facebook, which is probably the source for most young Americans, or Twitter or Instagram news feeds. And those sources are heavily infiltrated also by outside agents, Russia, for example. So we've got essentially a propaganda system that aims to amplify existing social divisions through hate, misinformation, disinformation. And then we've got a struggling news system that is still trying to report something that might resemble fact-based reality. But the two are not integrated, and they are, in fact, opposed in ways that fact-checking and media literacy are not going to help. Because back to a point I made at the very beginning, is that as you begin to attack institutions, the credibility of institutions, I mean, look at what's happened to the EPA. You know, carbon energy, fossil fuel energy interests are now running the EPA. The Centers for Disease Control has been paralyzed during this pandemic. People are now unsure, even on the left, about whether to take a vaccine if one is produced, because they don't know how much pressure Trump is going to produce on the FDA in its approval process. So now we have got these two media systems that are helping to continue the divisions in America that Chris was talking about. So if you fix the institutions, trusted informational return, and that large propaganda and disinformation media system will begin to shrink again. Mm-hmm. That's how I see it.
Well, you guys are remarkable, and you have so many insights, and there are other questions that are coming to us, and I think we're getting very close to being at the end of our time. So how do people, this is a terrible thing to do to you guys, how do people get a hold of you if they want to forward these questions to you? Because I know I don't have all the answers. Lance, do you have and then we'll go to Chris, but Lance, do you have are you comfortable? I don't want to put you on the spot. If you're not, that's okay too. Is there a website?
I think that what I would be interested in doing is seeing if Mohai can possibly set up a chat. Sure. And I'd be happy to go on asynchronously to a chat platform that you guys put up. That might be a nice adjunct to these sessions. And then I promise if people want to leave questions on that chat platform, and I'm sure you have a way of getting in touch with the audience, then I will be happy to go in and have a conversation. But my inbox is already a nightmare.
I know. I knew that was an unchecked issue. Chris, do you have a website that people can go to, or are you
I don't have a public chat platform, but you all must. So I invite you. I think that would be a fabulous addition to your programming.
Okay, well, we'll forward those things to you. And Chris, do you have a website that people can visit, or?
Yeah, I have an academic website and a public website. How about going to ChristopherSebastianParker.com?
I think that sounds good to me. ChristopherSebastianParker.com.
Yeah,
we'll remember that.
Go there, and if you want a faster response, just hit me in my UW email. My email box is a mess too. I'm not sure if it's as populated as Lance's is. I'd be surprised if it weren't, but maybe it is. I'm at csparker@uw.edu.
Okay, well, thank you guys. That's terrible to put you on the spot like that, but people are just so hungry for information and the kinds of insights you provide. You know, we had a democracy dialogue a few weeks ago with the Secretary of State and the Director of Elections in King County, and they advised us to have a voting plan, which I frankly had never really thought of before. I thought the voting plan was just when voted, but I began to think of a lot more. And I think what you guys are letting us know is you need to have a democracy plan as well. And we're all individually responsible for the future of this system that we all have such a stake. And, you know, as Christopher said at the very beginning, a hope for. I mean, I think that there's some real challenges, but we remain hopeful, I think, in a lot of ways. I do want to thank you again, both of you, for taking the time on a Saturday night, right at the dinner hour for a lot of us. And I also want to thank our sponsors, For Culture, the Boeing Company, and Maureen Frisch for sponsoring all the series of Stand Up Seattle, the Democracy Project at MOHI. We've got a couple of great programs coming up. We've got 2 more democracy dialogues in the pipeline. One is on November 14th. And one is on December 12th. Those will be both post-election, obviously, but also on October 17th. Let's flip to those, Nicole, because we've got a conversation that will be moderated by Enrique Cerna with quite a lineup of panelists, including David Domke and Charles Douglas, who are on the ground doing voter registration. So if you're, you know, concerned about or curious about voter registration and the critical challenges that this country's facing, making sure everyone has the right and exercises the right to vote, they'll be part of that conversation. We have some great historical perspective by Larry Gossett, who's seen both sides of the political situation, both as a leader and as a very active advocate and protester. So that's October 17th in our 2 democracy dialogues. And the programs are going to continue all the way into next year as well. So we're really excited about that. And I think with that, Nicole often says to us, we end abruptly because we'll just go blank on this, but do look to the MOHI YouTube channel if you'd like to see this repeated, or you want to catch up on some of those great comments that you missed and hear from our great speakers. And again, Lance Bennett and Christopher Sebastian Parker, thank you so much. Thank you for your work and your contributions to our community and our nation. And thanks everyone for joining MOHI. If you learned something new or you're interested in supporting us, there'll be a little donate button as you log off, or you can always go to mohi.org to learn more, join us, and support us. And to all of you, thank you very, very much. Have a good evening, stay safe, and be well. Good night.
Thank you.